Welcome to the HC Leadership Podcast, Forged in Fire, Led with Purpose, formerly known as the Heat of Command. We're here to explore what it takes to lead courageously authentic. From the fireground, battlefield, ballfield, classroom, or boardroom, we bring you real conversations to inspire, challenge, and drive change. Here are your hosts, Kyle Matusik and me, Kerry Henderson. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to HC Leadership Podcast, formerly known as the Heat of Command. And we're super happy that you guys are joining us again for another episode of the HC Leadership Podcast. And I was so excited after last episode. I talked to some folks that I had no idea had started tuning in, and they are not in the fire service. And I was so excited and felt very blessed that people were interested in what we had to say. And I got to thinking back about last episode, and I wanted to make sure that we are covering every walk of life of people that want to listen to us. And our experience is primarily from the fire service. And Kyle, you have some military leadership experience too, which is great. And you bring that to the table. But I really want this to be a place where leaders from every industry can come and listen and feel like it pertains to them. So when I was thinking about today's episode, it's like, what would be really important for listeners across every job or every space where leaders are that could resonate with everyone. And I thought about, what if there is this misconception, because we're in the fire service and we mimic a lot of our leadership off of military style leadership. Maybe some of that's antiquated. Maybe it's not. Some of that is great. Some of it is we could do a little differently. But I think there's this misconception that leaders, especially in our industry, are loud and commanding. And that is very true in some of the spaces that we do have to lead. But across the majority of times when we are leading on a day-to-day basis, it's not loud. And I don't want people in other walks of life and other jobs to think, do I have to be loud? Do I have to be the loudest person in the room to be the leader of the group? Like, what if I'm not the loudest in my group? Can I still lead those people? And the answer is absolutely yes. And that's the question Kyle and I are going to talk about today is, what if my decibels are lower or quieter than the other decibels in the room? And how can I lead from that space? And I think it kind of crosses over to my personal experience where when I first stepped into leadership role in the fire service, I thought my style was too feminine because I hadn't seen a whole lot of the way I like to lead before in the fire service. So I thought there was no place for that, which was not true. I just needed to lean into it more. And so I think this can be kind of the same kind of same avenue is, you don't have to be loud. Even if you see loud leaders and people that always speak in meetings and they always command the space and they always have an opinion, it doesn't have to be that way. And we'll give some examples of how that plays out and how it builds trust and how you can make it work. And I also want to talk about, there's 100 things I want to talk about, but I also want to talk about, if you are a very loud and commanding leader, how sometimes you can dial it back and be just as effective.
Yeah, it comes down to influence. I mean, that's the main goal of the idea behind leadership. It's about influence, and that can be done in so many different ways. And typically, just like you mentioned with our backgrounds, and even when you go into the leadership space and you're listening to the podcast or reading the books, a lot of people have like some awesome stories that have brought them to drastic leadership roles. And the lessons that they have learned are extremely valuable, but sometimes it's hard to fully grasp what some people have been through or even be on that level. But that does not mean that anybody out there can't be a leader. We don't need to go through these extraordinary circumstances or these extraordinary events to be an effective leader. And, a lot of the times it comes back to who's sitting against the wall just observing and listening. That's one of the biggest powers of a leader, the ability to listen. And that's a superpower. And when we get these commanding leaders, sometimes that's one of the faults or the weaknesses of their leadership. So as we've gone through this over years, and we're just examining kind of all aspects of this leadership realm, because there is just so much to cover in terms of this. But at the end of the day, it is everybody has an ability, w- no matter what career you're in, no matter what your background is in, no matter if you've done heroic things or non-heroic things, like none of that really matters. It comes down to influence, your ability to, work on a human level with people, empathy, compassion, all these things matter, and different environments call for different types of leadership. Absolutely. So, it's really exciting to kind of continually challenge myself and you, Carrie, just to look at these different aspects. And, I come back to one of my first leadership lessons, and it was in the military. It's crazy to say this, right? It was 20 years ago. Wow. Over 20 years ago. Where's time go? But, back then it was, especially then, the loudest, most commanding. You didn't need to be a leader, but if you were loud and commanding, you were deemed a leader. And you might not have any leadership ability or traits, but you were loud and commanding. So that's how it was looked. And in the military, it was really that way. And you get promoted and you're an NCO, you're a non-commissioned officer. And it's like, I'm in charge now. Look at me. And there were some big lessons learned during that time. Absolutely. But and now 20 years later, you're looking back and I can see how I completely failed in that role, and that wasn't leadership. And now looking at and talking about an area of how quiet leaders can build trust. Listening is a superpower, and it's all about influence where anybody can do it. So, I know when I started going down this road and started reading the book, sometimes I would get intimidated by some of the stories that I read, because you're like, I'm not on that level, nor will I ever be on that level. And so, as we read those, it's taking those lessons out of certain people's stories, because, at the end of the day, some of those things I am never going to do or never going to be, and that's okay. There's still valuable lessons within somebody's personal story. So I think that's the cool part about it all. We can continually grow with people's stories, but just don't get intimidated by the backgrounds of certain things that you read or you listen to and stuff. Just take the tidbits and continue to grow in that. But yeah, being quiet, being up against the wall, that is just a different area for us to sit and discuss about. But it's just one of those things where I think one of the most important is the listening as a superpower, because when you're loud, sometimes we miss the things that are not said. And I think that's the biggest thing. And you have that quiet leader who can examine everything, who could see the cues, the nonverbal communication that's going on, can see on a deeper level what's going on within an organization or environment, and then start to develop strategies to combat that, where a loud leader could miss all those subtle cues and just go in a completely different and wrong direction.
Yeah. And I'm sure everyone can think of examples in your workplace or in your life where there are those folks who don't speak right away, and they sit and they're still and they're calm and they're listening and they're taking it all in. And then when they do speak, everyone listens. They're like, ah, and it's almost I see this so many times at meetings at the folks that behave that way. The person running the meeting will almost always say at the end, "Well, what do you think?" Because if you haven't spoken, they know you're taking it all in and that you have a very valuable opinion, and they wanna know that person's opinion because they aren't always sharing that, like, right away, and that is one of my biggest faults, and I go into a ton of meetings and a ton of spaces where I say, "I'm not gonna speak, I'm not gonna talk," because I I always have something to say, and my synapses are firing so quickly that I'm like, "Okay, we can fix this, we can fix this, we can fix this," and I have, like, an option for it, like, right away. And I purposely, like, try to sit on my hands or calm my body so that I can listen better, and I try to sit there, and I fail every time. I'm like 5 minutes in, and I've opened my mouth. And I'm like, Well, there you go." So that is something I'm constantly working on, and I admire the folks that take it all in first, put it all together in a very well thought out presentation, and then they speak. It's so beautiful, and it really then builds a ton of calm into every situation, because most of those people that I know that are that way in meetings are that way in very stressful situations. So I'm not talking just on the fire ground, but in very stressful interpersonal conflicts that they're dealing with, stressful meetings, stressful, like, anything. And on fire scenes, they're just very calm, cool, and collective because they're listening and they're able to process that information at their speed and on their level without getting riled up. And then, the brain, when it's in that mode, is calm. You're not getting tunnel vision. The neuroscience behind all of that makes total sense when you think about it, right? And I think then, even more beautiful, you talked about influence. It builds trust when you have people that aren't over how do you say, over speaking, over talking over you, and they aren't embarrassing you in public, or they aren't, you know, making fun of other people, and they're calm and they're collected. All of that builds this trust, and your brain senses that. And whether it's in a boardroom, if you're a sports coach, wherever you're in a space where you're leading, and if you're able to build trust, and the brain of other people senses that, man, the camaraderie that you build and the willingness, people are willing to try harder because they know they can make mistakes then in front of you. It's just this whole cascade of events that happens, and I love to see when that plays out, and we can talk some more about kind of the how the brain senses that if you want, because I find that, like, really interesting, like, what your amygdala does, and, oxytocin, and what oxytocin does, I think is interesting. Is I read a study that said people that were given nasal spray oxytocin, like the feel good hormone, were more willing to cooperate and, like, come on board and participate. Like, well, we could just walk around and spray people with it all the time, or we could build it naturally, and that's building trust. And this is one way great leaders who aren't overbearing and loud can build trust very easily this way if they open up space for people that way, and then people are much more willing to come on board with you.
Yeah, as you were kinda talking, I was thinking a little bit, and the conversation, it's almost like, we've been doing this for a couple years now, and examining things, and it's almost like we're starting to identify these issues and things in terms of leadership, and it is very countercultural to what we think leadership is or was, and we look at something like quiet leadership, and I just think like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would we be even having this conversation about quiet leadership, or would we even, consider that the people sitting in the background, the quiet ones, are leaders, and as you get older and more experienced, you kind of start to see the benefits in doing so, and just kind of sitting in the background and watch and taking it all in constantly, and like I said, different environments call for different things, but, to be an effective leader in this day and age, it's almost going countercultural to everything that is happening in your environments and your industries, because we've often mistaken extroversion, for leadership, and introverts can't be leaders, but we know that's not true, right? And we see great leaders who are just on the sidelines because they just don't want to get in all the mess of, sometimes it's just a mess. We're in roles that force the hand or think require us to speak above everybody or speak at a commanding level or dictate things. And sure, there's times and places for that. But in the big scheme of things, True leadership is not that. It is having a pulse on every aspect of the environment in which you're involved in. And I think you can only do that if you have the ability to sit in the background and kind of watch from time to time and listen from time to time. One of those things you were talking about meetings, and one of the interesting things, and I think this is a point that is probably commonly seen in the workplace today. And I think we're just at these every generation brings a new culture with them. And, I think we're at this point where it's this us versus them kind of generation bash in some aspects. And we're always going to have that in the workplace. That's never going to go away. But so how do you make sure your voice is heard in a room full of strong personalities? Because, like I said, culturally, strong personalities were deemed the leaders, even if they're not leaders at all. You just deem them leaders because of their personality. So how do you make sure your voice is heard in a room full of those strong personalities? And I think that's a very challenging spot to be in. And I bet you a lot of people out there find themselves in those situations. So how do we overcome that?
That's a great question. And, thinking about this episode and thinking about how I show up, and, I do talk a lot, and I, that's just my personality. But one thing that I do that I think helps me, and maybe it could help others, is leaders who are willing to show vulnerability. So you're showing up into a space where there's strong personalities, loud voices, and you're nervous about that. Show up as how you are, not how you think you need to be. Even if it's weird and awkward, and be vulnerable about that, because I think it always builds trust, and trust increases oxytocin. And what does oxytocin do? It helps you want to participate and cooperate and be part of the team. So when I go into a space, I want to gain the trust of those that are in the room. And sometimes I'm weird about it. Sometimes I'm awkward and I have to be vulnerable about it. And, even when we go out and speak, a lot of times especially if I'm by myself, I'll tell people I'm nervous because I don't have Kyle here. So I'm nervous. And then people are like, oh, hey, look, she just admitted she's nervous. And good for her for standing up there and being nervous. And it builds some trust in the room. And I think vulnerability goes a long, long way for leaders. And you think about if you can build that trust in a space like that where yes, it's stressful to be in a room full of your peers and talking and speaking or whatever, but think about really high stress situations in careers like ours or in the military or in other places like even on the ball field where it's a stressful game and you've built this trust in different spaces and now it carries over into these other places where you're leading. So you got to build that trust first in these kind of low stress situations. And then the brain remembers. So then you're out on the ball field, you're in a very high stress negotiation over a deal, and the brain remembers and the brain remembers that trust and those chemicals can automatically be released and go, hey, I'm safe here. I'm very safe here and I'm okay.
Yeah, it's interesting when I look at like strong personalities and I think of a meeting room or a boardroom that's filled with strong personalities and you go in and you want to be heard. It's I could I totally agree with the vulnerability, but I also from personal experience know that that might not work in that moment and in that group of strong personalities. Like it in some places it won't work. And I totally understand that. So then the question becomes, how do we overcome that? How do we continue forward as leaders? And just because it's not working in that room, in that meeting amongst those people doesn't mean it's not working. When we take this journey and we decide we want to be leaders or we want to be, in charge of something or people, and we think we can have big influence outside of, ourselves or our families, when you decide to take that journey, you're going to hit so many roadblocks in that journey and you're going to face so many different challenges. And if you go back and listen to the things we've talked about, read books, sometimes it seems all hunky dory and some of these things are easy, but a lot of lessons that Kerry and I have learned through the years have been, very difficult lessons, and how we've overcome that and how we persevered forward and continued to go. So even if you find yourself in these situations where your voice is not being heard and you're trying, that might not be the environment, but still go down the road of, you know, that vulnerability or being quiet and just continue to build what you think works or doesn't work because let's face it, you're going to try some things they're not going to work and you're going to try other things and they are going to work. You're going to try some things that you think every leader needs to be, but it's not going to be received very well. And on the flip side of that, maybe some traits that aren't the most sought after in leadership, but people like those. So a lot of times it's just this constant balance of challenges and overcoming and learning, and it's just a mess. It's a hot mess sometimes to go down this road of being an effective leader in this day and age. And I will say, as we talk about being that quiet leader, observant and listening, very important for the people who are just getting into the workforce or getting ready to get into the workforce. This is your opportunity to start playing around with all these different traits. Now, if you've been in the workforce or wherever you're leading for 10, 15 years and you've developed a reputation and now you're trying to change and do things a little bit differently, you need to be ready to handle the pushback that you're going to get with that. All of a sudden you're this loud commanding leader and you've been that way for 10 years. The next thing you know, you're quiet up against the wall. People are going to say things, they're going to ask questions. And so it's your approach on how you want to handle that. And it could be something as simple, I'm trying something new. I've been working on myself lately. I've made some mistakes in the past. I just want to start going down a different road, and that's where the vulnerability comes in, where we can be honest about and maybe we don't need to divulge the entire story, but yeah, I made some mistakes in the past. I want to go down a different road and try some different things. And I think this is a better approach for leadership within our organization. I want to be a better listener. I want to sit and get a pulse on the organization and everybody in there. And I feel like the only way I can do that is keeping my mouth shut and observing and listening. And I think those are just really powerful ways to build as a leader. And the younger you are getting in, sometimes you just got to sit and watch. And what you can learn from just doing that is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and across any industry, I think it's really important too that quiet leaders are those that are building others up without taking all the recognition. They're not micromanaging. I think sometimes boisterous leaders have a tendency to micromanage because they want to have a say, right? The last say or have a say in everything. So I think if your personality is more of the calm, listening type, you have that going for you because you're probably less likely to be a micromanager and let things kind of play out and then give feedback as necessary. And I think that's really, really a wonderful, wonderful way to lead your people. It's really about being present too and not always talking about performance. And we've done episodes about that before where it's really just, about your presence. And I was thinking about all the different leadership places, leadership spaces, and like how this would kind of play out for them, and 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 how we could deliver this message for anybody listening. And so I was thinking about teachers specifically. I'm like, okay, teachers in the classroom, and I know so many teachers out there that are just killing it in the classroom, and that's not where they're having struggles, right? They're connecting with our kiddos and they're doing their best they can. But in these school systems with all these constraints and all these rules and all these laws and all the standardized testing and all this stuff that strap the hands of teachers that just want to love on our kids and teach them and support them, that was not the message I needed to, I did, we don't need to talk to teachers about how they're supporting our kids and how they're leading our kids, because I 99% of the ones I know, they're killing it. It's the leadership in the school systems that every single teacher that I know is struggling with, and it might not be, their direct leaders, it might be school systems or school divisions that they're struggling with. And so that's who I really wanted to talk to, like when I was thinking about this episode was, how do you do it for how do we do it for teachers? And it was really, supporting teachers and praising teachers and giving them space to do what they do best instead of strapping them with, professional development, which I'm sure certain amount of that is mandatory, but, giving them time and space to do what they do best and praising and not constant criticism. And I wish there was a way that we could rewind back to when I was in school in the 80s and 90s, and the way the teachers, they let them teach. It's like, "You're an English teacher? You know how to teach English. Teach English." And it's like we've basically told teachers and a whole industry of folks that we don't believe you that you know how to deliver that, so we're gonna standardize literally every single moment of your day, and this is what you have to do. And it does that type of system, in my opinion, doesn't work for every kid, it doesn't work for every teacher, and it's setting our kids up for failure. That's my soapbox for tonight.
You're like gearing me up to go. Well, it becomes you start looking at the culture, and our society of all these things, and you know, I'm in the middle of my career, and I feel like I'm at a point where I'm just seeing that so much in leadership roles is about control. And, bringing it to the school boards, whatever, and et cetera, and not the teachers. And it's like as certain generations moved up, they just wanted to retain this level of control. And it's like, sidebar to our being quiet conversation. But as you build as a leader and you move up, like sometimes leadership is relinquishing control over the things that you used to, and you have to put the trust back into the people who are actually doing the job. And that's not just in teaching, that's, in our profession where I see it wholeheartedly, where, people have moved up and they just want to retain this control. So now everything is micromanaged, and, position that I hold today, is not given the same responsibility and trust as it did 10 years ago. And it's like, what happened? Like I, it's crazy to me. And, so, message for all the people that are in the upper echelon, like, hey, relinquish your control and let your people do the job. That if you want to build future leaders and we want to, continue to progress and have a continuity plan and build people for the future, like we have to do that. We have to set people up for success and let them do the jobs that they're trained to do and they're capable of doing. So there's my soapbox. Thank
Yeah, and we have talked before about action over
Yeah.
words, and I think it's so important here that if you say you're going to do something, that you follow through with it. Not, "Hey, yeah, I'll look into that," or whatever, but for any culture and any industry, and we're talking about building trust and having influence, if you wanna build trust, do what you say you're gonna do. So if you're a leader and your folks are begging for some sort of change. They're asking for even or something small. They're asking for something small and you say, "Yeah, I'll look into that and see if that's something I can do." And you never come back with anything, you never follow up with anything. That's a very small component that has a big, big impact in what we're talking about and in in the sphere of influence and trust is do what you say you're gonna do, follow up, good open communication, that builds so much trust because I get it. There are so many workplaces and so many industries where you are strapped by regulation, right? And it's hard to make a decision without going through so much red tape, laws and rules and whatever else it is that you're up against. But if you're constantly communicating like, "Hey, I get your pain and the empathy behind, I understand your frustration and let me see what I can do and incrementally try to make change," and talking about that and then, coming back with results and, following back up with people and staying in constant communication is huge, huge for trust. And that does not have to be loud.
Yeah. One last thing I want to, kind of hit on too is the balance between being approachable and humble versus being decisive and authoritative. And I think this is a tough thing to do because sometimes you could look at people who are quiet and sitting in the background, and you could be very intimidated by that. Right. So, how do you maintain that approachability but still being decisive and or authoritative.
Interesting. That's interesting.
Because you have to think of some industries and environments where that is needed, and not just what we do, but even in the boardroom where tough decisions need to be made quickly, or just tough decisions need to be made, or, a different strategy on how to build something or approach to an issue or a problem and all these things. So we need to be approachable, yet we need to be authoritative. And, I think that is one of those things that is built over time. I don't think anybody can come into any industry with 5 years on and be able to be both those things. As you continue to learn and build as an effective leader, it's just all going to take time. So you might learn on being approachable and then later on being authoritative, and then you got to clash the two, right?
Yeah.
You need to learn what both the strengths of both traits are, get rid of the weakness parts of those traits, and then mesh them, over a course of 10, 15, 20 years to be able to develop those kinds of different traits. Because approachable, right? You have to be quiet. You have to be humble. You have to be happy. You have to be someone that people trust. I mean, we always come back to the word trust, but you have to be excited to want to engage with other people, not miserable when somebody wants to come talk to you. But then at the flip side, you have to be authoritative. You have to be able to stand up and sometimes speak your mind and put your ideas out there and make a decision that might be tough. So, and that takes courage to do so. It also takes trust. And I think, as you're early on in your career, the more you're able to build that trust when you have to be authoritative, like people will just get it. And it's just like, they had to do that. He or she had to do that, and I get it. And that's that. But that's, again, building those traits over a course of time to be able to do that. I think it'd be very challenging for somebody to come in early in a career and be approachable and authoritative all at the same time.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're going to work on being authoritative or being more decisive, because I see some folks that, are quiet and they need to take in a ton of information to make a decision. And if you know that about yourself, work on ways or learn about yourself. What is it that I need to feel comfortable to make a decision? Because there's usually a threshold of I need a certain amount of information or a certain amount of pros and cons or a certain amount of what ifs answered before I can make a decision, and figure out what that is for you. Because in certain circumstances, you're not going to get all of that, right? And I think some people are fine in certain circumstances where they know they have to make a quick decision because they have enough, I guess, intellectual ability at their job that they can do that. But when it comes to like long range decision making things and things that need to be thought out more, like what do you need to know to build your comfort level to make that decision, and then try to work towards that so that you're not, always let me think about it, or not willing to make a decision in the moment, or you take a really long time to make a decision and then people are frustrated with you. Like what is it? What is that balance for you? So that's something you could work towards. The authoritative stuff, like just like you said, I totally agree that that takes some time. And that takes confidence and composure, and we've talked about that in other episodes. If you wanna hear more about that, I encourage you to listen to some of our episodes about building composure and confidence and how that kinda stems from values and some other self-reflection work that Kyle and I love to talk about.
Yeah, every time we talk and have these discussions, it's just so, like, when we look at leadership, it is so intertwined with so many different aspects of what it takes. And every environment and personalities that you have to deal with require different things. And to go down a road of being an effective leader is just extremely challenging, and it is ever evolving. So as we learn one trait and we become better at that, like, it could all change because the newer culture coming in requires something different. So it's being adaptive, and that's where being quiet and being able to view everything and get a pulse on things is extremely beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this was great.
It was.
I wasn't
Always
sure where
is.
this was gonna go, but I really wanted to talk about it.
We say that every time.
I know.
And it's
Yeah.
always good, I
Yeah, and I'm
think.
so glad we have listeners tuning in and checking us out, and stay with us. And if you have stuff you want us to talk about, shoot us some messages on our platforms and we'd love to chat. And let's see, I had a takeaway, let's see, that I had written down and I didn't want to forget it. Let's see, where was my takeaway I wrote down? True leaders don't need the spotlight. They create the stage for others to shine.
You've been listening to the HC Leadership Podcast. Leadership isn't rank or title, it's how you show up. So go look in the mirror. Are you leading with purpose today? Keep reflecting, keep leading. Until next time.